just like to welcome you all, and I just want to thank Brian for giving me, I feel very honoured to be asked to open the two-day conference, UFO conference here in Sydney. And I just want to make mention of those people on the committee that have diligently worked to bring everybody together. I'd like to start with Brian Dickerson for the work that he's put in, and his trusting Treasurer Elizabeth Burdick, and Dudley Robb, who's put a lot of work in as well. And all the technical help are Andrew Leese, Wendy Leese, Peter Turner, Wendy Burnham, Gary Hegner, and Dave Moffat. I'd also like to mention Hugh Mulgrove, who unfortunately is not able to be here. He's one of their backstays and helpers, and unfortunately at this time he's in hospital, or was yesterday, having an operation. So if we could all just send our prayers of healing to Hugh. And I think there might be is there a get well card floating around somewhere that we can...
We'll have to arrange one.
Okay, right. So I'd just like to just ask that we can dedicate perhaps this conference over the weekend and give lots of thoughts to all those people that have given their time and help in bringing all this together, because, you know, there is a total awareness out there, and I think it's wonderful that we have so many excellent speakers that have accumulated a lot of knowledge over the years that have wanted to bring it to you, the delegates, to share. And I'd just like to say welcome to you all, and I'm quite sure you're going to have an excellent weekend with all the wonderful knowledge and information that's going to be imparted to you. And I'd just like to just bow our heads for a moment and just say a little prayer and ask Great Divine Spirit, Mother, Father, God, we ask that this weekend that we can bring knowledge and healing and help all those people that are here. And also I'd like to ask for healing of this planet. And I always find that truth is within ourselves, and I think we need to turn within to find that truth. But most of all, learn to be a little bit more open and understanding than speakers are up there in front trying to get information. And this is a weekend, this is a very important weekend where you're here to ask questions, to be helped and to learn. So learn what's going on out there in this big wonderful world of ours. So I'd just like to pass this now back to Brian, and let's get on with the weekend and enjoy every moment of it. And also remember that upstairs there's tables all around here, both on this floor and upstairs, where there's a lot of articles being sold and information. So feel free in intervals to wander around and look and see what you can find. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Glennis.
Sorry, floor.
Sorry, the second floor.
Second floor, I'm sorry.
Downstairs.
What are we on? Downstairs, I'm sorry. See, I'm so used to being up in that spacecraft that I forget where I am.
Downstairs. Thank you very much, Glennis. Now, we'll just have a very short break while we test the microphones, and then we'll go straight into the very first talk, which is Martin Gottschall. Hopefully that should start in a couple of minutes. Thank you very much.
During the late 1960s, he became interested in UFOs, and he subsequently joined the UFO Research Queensland and the Australian Centre for the UFO Studies. As chairperson for the UFO Research Group in Queensland for over a decade now, over 10 years, Martin is the present administrator of ACUFOS. That was the Australian National Organization for UFOs, and plays a key role in the UFO investigation scene here in Australia, and is well known by everyone here. His interest in the subject has since broadened to encompass the entire phenomenon and its implications for our future. His theme, the UFO quest, once we become aware of the reality of the UFO phenomenon, we ask, what else didn't I know? And this sets us up on a lifelong quest that encompasses both the inner and the outer space of our journey. I'd also like to mention that today is a very special day for Martin, of course. Some 60 years ago, he was born on this planet. And I'm very happy to have him here with us today, so also a happy birthday to Martin. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please let me make a couple of corrections to that wonderful introduction. I was chairperson of the association in Queensland for only a few years, not 10 years, but I've been on their committee for about that length of time, or twice that. And in regard to the Australian Centre for UFO Studies, that body has been dormant for the last few years, although I'm hopeful that with the current changes, including the internet and a few other such things, things will become practical for a national body with membership scattered around the country that hadn't been so practical before, and I'm hopeful that ACUFOS will become functional again in the foreseeable future. Now I'd like to address the topic of my talk today, the UFO quest. As I've studied this subject over the years, it gradually dawned on me, it took a long time in my case, it gradually dawned on me that I really was on a quest. That at first I was just after how to build a UFO and how to make it fly. That was what I really wanted to do way back when I first became interested. And I really didn't want to know the rest of the stuff. But it gradually dawned on me that it's all one package. If you want one, you have to have it all. Because it just doesn't make sense until you look at the whole thing. And I suspect many of the people here today are on a quest too, although they may have never put it in those sorts of terms. This first overhead I've prepared here shows the title of my talk with a couple of footprints, which some of you I'm sure will recognize. We are following in the footsteps of other cosmic civilizations. And I think it's rather fitting that one of the first public meetings between the occupant of a UFO and a human individual that was witnessed by some half a dozen people. On that occasion, when these two persons met in the desert in California, the visitor took pains to leave clear footprints, or those footprints in the sand at California. One of the observers, who was an anthropologist, later took plaster casts of that print, and you see it there. When you first went to primary school, you started in grade 1, and there were other children in grades 3 to 4, 5, right up to whatever. And as we discover that the universe contains other civilizations, we're in grade 1 and others are in the more advanced levels of development. It's just the way it is. It doesn't make us dumber or anything else. There's always going to be someone ahead of you and there's always going to be someone behind you. It's the same in the school system and it's the same in the larger school, and that's the quest we're on. One of the aspects of this quest is the enormity, the mind-boggling enormity of it. I think it's taken us the best part of the last 50 years to come to terms with the idea that the extraterrestrial visitations that are taking place here are putting us in touch with the whole of the rest of the universe. It isn't just people in the neighboring stars systems who come and visit. Some of the visitors have come from mind-boggling distances. The UFO phenomenon compresses the whole universe right to our doorstep. And it's becoming apparent to some of us too that maybe all of time is similarly being compressed in this way. That when you see a UFO, you could be seeing something from the future, what we might call our future, or something from what we might call our past. So both time and space are, as it were, compressed and brought to us in the UFO phenomenon. This makes it a huge thing. Everything you ever dared to dream of but couldn't quite bring yourself to entertain is implied in this UFO phenomenon. And of course, in that very process, we are being obliged to look at the most profound questions about the nature of life. Another big quest. That's always been a quest, hasn't it? People have devoted their lives to that theme. You cannot study the UFO phenomenon and not pick that one up as well. So I hope you won't mind me calling this interest a quest. It is just so mind-bogglingly far-reaching. And I liken it to the crusades that people went on in the Middle Ages. Many of them went on a quest too. They were searching for the Holy Grail, the thing that would liberate them from all the limitations and shortcomings and ignorance of their day. Not all, of course, but some did. Okay, now I wonder if you could put the second overhead on. When I determined the title of this, Cheryl and I sort of kicked a few around. I thought it was an original title, but then I discovered a book in my library with that, and I wanted to acknowledge the fact that the title wasn't so original. Alan Watts's book is concerned more with the technical aspects of the UFO phenomenon. That's in fact why I got the book, but the title there, The UFO Quest, is the title of his book. The idea is in the ethers, isn't it? Thank you. Would you put the next one on, number 3? Could you turn that? Yes, thanks. One of the recently I spoke to a group of retired persons and was asked quite a few I was speaking on the subject of UFOs and I was asked a few searching questions. One of them was, why hasn't SETI found anything yet, given that life is so abundant in the universe as we sometimes claim? Why has SETI found nothing? So I thought I would, I couldn't give a good answer at the time, but later something occurred to me which I thought I'd pass on to you. We've been sending out electromagnetic radio messages for the last century or so. And these have been propagating through space, and they've gone about 100 light years in the time since Marconi and others, Tesla, first played around with radio. In fact, it is a volume of space of about 4 million cubic light years that contains information about planet Earth on its radio waves and television and the rest of it. That represents close to 500,000 star systems where other people doing SETI could find out about us. And each decade that increases at the present time by something of the order of 360,000 cubic light years, implying something like 30 or 40,000 star systems that couldn't get us before will start to get our messages if they were looking for them. And the reason I put this up is it maybe wasn't such a smart thing for us to advertise our existence in this way, because amongst all these many thousands of star systems and presumably comparable numbers of civilizations, not all of them are so nice to know. We're advertising the fact that here is a planet so mixed up, so confused, so divided, so stupid, they're just ripe for the picking. And maybe the abduction phenomenon and the things we see there is the response to what we're doing here. Someone found out that here is a planet where you can get a few things for free. And maybe that is why some of the other civilizations who are a bit smarter than us are a little bit more discreet about how they advertise their existence. That's possibly one of the answers why SETI is going to be looking real hard, and when they do finally get something, it'll be because someone meant them to get it, not because they found it by chance. Would you put on the next slide, please? Now, when the UFO phenomenon began in the public domain about 50 years ago, the idea that this was a really phenomenal and remarkable and unprecedented phase in human history became very apparent to a lot of people. And it was in those years that UFO research sort of did its great split, and the people who sensed that they were on a quest became one kind of group, and the people who were going to do these things scientifically and who wouldn't entertain the notion of a quest became another kind of group. That division started right then in the 50s. One of the men who was on the quest side of this equation is George Adamski. This picture was taken in Sydney. I thought you might like to see it. George spoke here in Sydney in about 1959. The local UFO group were their hosts, and later there was a meeting at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Bloom, where this photograph was taken, and the lady in the background was one of the great supporters of the organization. I think I've got her name in my notes here at that time. Thank you. The next one, please. So I'll just briefly refer you to some of the early contactees who, in my mind, were the people who recognized the significance of what was happening. This book details that event of the meeting between two persons which resulted in those footprints that you've already seen. It was originally published together with another book by Desmond Leslie. And it basically documents that encounter, amongst other things. Next one, please. George Adamski, that is to say, later had a number of meetings with extraterrestrials. I accept his claims at face value. I realize not everyone does. But I suggest if you've been told that George was a fraud and a liar, and you've never read his work yourself, it's time you did. You might have a very different view if you actually looked at what Adamski said and looked at it with the hindsight of 50 years more technical progress, and you'd marvel at how well what he had to say has kept in time, how it withstood the test of time. Here are some of his photographs. He was an avid photographer. He tried very hard in the late 1940s to get good pictures of UFOs after having seen a number, and he was fairly successful. He then later had a number of meetings and became one of the contacts of this subject, contactees I should say, that is to say a person who claims to have met the extraterrestrials, had conversations with them, and has been given certain amounts of information. And I think this information that we get from contactees is a most vital aspect of the UFO phenomenon, far too long neglected from serious study. Next, please. Another one of these was Daniel Fry, an electrical engineer who went for a ride in a UFO occupied only by himself, operated remotely. And if you would lower this down, there's a picture in the top of that. You can just see it there. He obtained a number of photographs. This one was on a part of a movie footage. He too had communication with a particular extraterrestrial, and these communications are described in the book The White Sands Incident, and is another one of those things that you should study if you want to understand the nature of the quest you're on. Next, please. You can see that this couple, Brian and Helen Reeve, appreciated what they were on. They published this book, Flying Saucer Pilgrimage. It was actually published first in the 50s, although this particular issue came out a lot later. They went around and they met, amongst others, George and the other contactees, both in Mexico and the United States, to try and assess what this was all about, and realized that they were witnessing the dawning of a most unusual phenomenon in our history. Next, please. So you see, in the 1950s, this is all 1950s stuff, people realized the significance of what had happened. George Hunt Williamson was one of the group that observed Adamski meet that ET who came out of a landed disc, as described in Flying Saucers Have Landed. He then became a member of a contact group, a group of individuals, about half a dozen or so, who used radio and other methods to communicate with a corresponding ET group. And these communications are detailed in the book The Flying Saucers Speak. These also happened in the early 1950s, around 1952. And surprisingly, this hasn't continued to happen. You would have thought UFO research groups would pick up on what George did, what Williamson and his group did, and carry on having contacts like that. But it didn't continue like that. Next, please. But the information contained in those contacts, again, is most important and useful. I don't have a direct publication of Truman Bertram's experience. You see that little sketch there? There's a man standing by a car, and this large disc is landing near the ground. In Bertram's case, that disc was about 100 yards across, and he was actually a mechanic working on a road gang building roads through the desert in western United States. He had the evening shift, so he'd take his lunch break around midnight and drive off into the desert, have a bit of a rest. And so it happened that he had a series of meetings with a particular craft captained by a lady ET with a crew of smallish people. They were all sort of around a 5-foot size or less. And again, there were a number of conversations and the transmission of a certain body of information. And in fact, it is the lady who spoke to Besseram who expressed her concern about protecting her home planet from what she called space pirates, which brings me back to that earlier image I showed you of how we've been broadcasting our existence to many thousands of star systems inadvertently, some of which may not be very friendly inclined. Next, please. And in Don Kehoe, we see the beginning of the split in the early UFO research community. Now, I don't wish to play down Donald Kehoe's contribution to the subject. It's most significant. Kehoe was a retired military man, Navy, I think, but he had access to military information on UFOs. He was given the clearance to publish a total of 41 Air Force UFO reports, some of which contained combined sightings by eye, by radar, and by pilot of the same object. Okay, so there's some excellent sort of evidence for UFOs contained in his reports. Now, obviously, to get that clearance, no doubt Kehoe had to make a few promises, and one of them was that, I would guess, he never said it to me or anyone else to our knowledge, I suspect one of the promises he had to make is that he wasn't going to do anything to give credibility to people like Adamski, who were contemporaries of his at that time, who claimed to have spoken to the occupants of UFOs. So while Don Kehoe, for him UFOs were very real, you would never think they contained any living thing the way he treated the subject. And that became one of the strands, it seems to be, historically, of UFO research. Go on, next please. Now, one of the sad things about the way in which contactees were neglected is, if you bring it down a little, some of the information, of course, which was very vital to us, has been neglected too. In recent decades, with the advent of the abduction phenomenon, a lot of more recent UFO researchers thought that the early contactee phenomenon was just all make-believe. How could it have been factual? They don't look like that. The greys don't, you see. Of course, no one would suggest that everyone in the universe looks human, but that doesn't mean that some can't look human. The thing is that the contactee account, every single one of them that I know of, contained warnings about what we've later come to recognize as the abduction phenomenon. Here, for example, if you can just make out my highlighting, I don't think I can go too far. That top paragraph there, if you can just make out the highlighting, it talks about, that statement attributed to an ET talks about civilizations existing in other solar systems where those civilizations have advanced considerably in technical terms, but not at all in social and the more humanitarian aspects of their development. And they have achieved space travel. They could be visiting planet Earth. And if you met them, you might not enjoy the encounter terribly much. That was the inference. That was right there, the very first meeting Adamski had with an ET, where they sat down and talked, that warning was given. You'll find it in the next one, the radio messages of George Hunt Williamson and his group. There is an explicit statement about in the middle of that paragraph, the second one. We must tell you that Orion is coming. Saras is their word for Earth, in a square star body. The year of decision is soon to come to you. That warning was given about 1952. And we have these allegations that in 1954, the President of the United States entered certain agreements with certain aliens. Do you remember those claims? I'm sure you've heard of them. Another warning, see? And it was just ignored at the time too. I'll leave the last paragraph till later. That relates to something else. So there were these people right in the 50s who I think saw more clearly than the scientifically oriented persons the nature of the UFO phenomenon and its implications. And they've tended to be classed with the cultists and the crazies and the rest of them, and what they had to offer has been similarly ignored, and I think we should redress that. That hasn't served us well. It has probably cost us greatly, and it's time to become a lot more balanced in our efforts to understand the UFO phenomenon by going back and having another look at what these people said. Because this is not going to be repeated for us until we listen to it the first time. Don't think what you hear today is going to tell you what was told 50 years ago. You've got to go back and look at it. It's not going to come a second time. No one's going to waste their time like that. Okay, now, I just want to comment briefly on... now, my background is in engineering, so I've had a certain amount of scientific training, stuff like physics and chemistry, mathematics and so on. And I think I inevitably became quite familiar with the scientific mindset, if I can use that phrase. And when I became interested in UFO phenomenon in the late 1960s and realized that thousands and thousands of people were reporting the same kinds of sightings and details, and tried to understand why scientists, particularly physicists, who should be really interested in something that implies the manipulation of gravity or stuff like that, you know, why they are not interested in this subject, even though many scientists themselves are reporting and seeing these things. I came to realize the extent to which our training also brainwashes us. We become kind of hypnotized. You go through, you know, years of education, and even while you go through primary and high school, the people who teach you are the people who've been trained by the same system as the ones that will teach you in the universities. So we've all gone through a lifelong process of training and conditioning. And I call it hypnosis in that it may not necessarily have been done deliberately, but it happened anyway. That in particular we've suffered a kind of intellectual hypnosis where we've become so fixed on certain beliefs. They're called theories in science, but they're basically beliefs. We're so hooked on them that if someone comes to us with facts that contradict that belief, instead of questioning the belief, we reject the facts. Okay? When you do that, when the facts are less meaningful to you than your beliefs, you're either fanatical or hypnotized, okay, in my terminology. So that's what I mean by this. Now, scientists behave in this intellectually hypnotized way in respect to certain things when certain basic beliefs into which they've been conditioned are brought to question. Anthony brought us in from the airport today and spoke of a man who had reported some unusual sighting in 1966, who was in the company of another person who refused to look at that UFO. Right? That's not unusual. Some people see it and then they'll never talk about it afterwards. That's another aspect of the same thing. Something that challenges our beliefs so deeply. It challenges our paradigm and our whole worldview so completely that rather than face it and all the overwhelming changes that come with it, it's easier, more convenient to pretend that it never happened. That's hypnosis, that's being hypnotized. Okay, now, one of the examples that the scientific community has displayed as regards hypnosis, intellectual hypnosis, apart from the way it has treated the UFO phenomenon, has to do with some of the unusual discoveries made about the nature of life. One of the fairly well presented pieces of research was that of Cleve Baxter, who reported his work in the 1960s. And you may recall that what he had discovered, and if I can have the next slide, please, it'll show you the reference where you can find it is this work written up in a convenient form. You've probably come across this book, The Secret Life of Plants by Tompkins and Bird. It's been around for a while. In it is a section on Cleve Baxter's work. Baxter published in a magazine and in a publication you wouldn't easily get your hands on, but the story is in here as well. My paper's got the original source of Now, what Baxter did is he was a lie detector expert. He wired up a plant with his lie detector apparatus so that the electrical activity or the change in resistance of the leaf of a plant could be recorded on a strip recorder. And then he thought he was going to do certain things to that plant, like not give it enough water or give it too much water or this and that. And he was going to see whether he could monitor levels of stress in the plant through this lie detector device. What he discovered, to his surprise, that the plant would respond to his intentions before he did anything to the plant. And then he later discovered that it would respond to the emotional experiences of other living things around too. For example, in one case, he arranged for a machine to randomly drop living shrimp into boiling water. And every time one of these little creatures hit the boiling water and went through the agony of death, that plant responded. The needle gave a blip. So he was producing hard evidence of a relationship between a particular plant and other living things. And the link could not be blocked out. You could do nothing to prevent that link. No concrete wall, no Faraday cage, every possible physical link could be blocked out, but the communication between those two living things couldn't. His discovery was of a tremendous order. Only people who sort of have a particular a view about the nature of life, like living things are merely chemical stuff in a more complex form, completely limited and bound by physical laws. Only people who had this view would find this incredibly challenging, because it completely challenges their fundamental view about the nature of life, which scientists are taught to believe, not because it's a fact, but because someone liked it to be that way and never brought up like that. And Baxter's work was just ignored. Here was a chance to open up a whole new vistas in the progress of science. And we didn't have the mental equipment to cope with it because of this, what I call intellectual hypnosis. So this is happening on a massive scale. And we in the field of UFO research, or if there are interests in UFOs who see the other side of this ability to ignore the facts, are well aware of this kind of thing happening. But it isn't just happening with regard to UFOs. Well, that's an example of intellectual hypnosis and its consequences, which is that we're destroying planet Earth and ourselves, and we don't know we're doing it, because we've had certain notions about the nature of life and how things are going to happen. The reality happens to disagree with that, but we go right on and we do things to ourselves and this planet that'll probably take us off this planet if we don't change our ways soon. But because we're fixed on certain ideas about how reality is, and we're not willing to change it. It'll cost us our existence if we don't learn better soon. So it's not a trivial thing at all. Now, this issue about the nature of life, and whether, for example, the physical universe came first and life evolved in the universe as evolutionary thinking indicates, or whether perhaps life existed and then a physical universe was created, which is a complete reversing of that type of thinking, or whether there is a kind of a situation where both can be true in certain places and situations, whether it's more ambiguous. These are important questions, and to fix oneself on one of these options, to the degree that we are unable to accept facts that support a contradictory one, is extremely dangerous for us to do. And that's what's happening in our community, and I just wanted to point it out because it's not trivial. It affects our future. I wanted to explore, then, ideas about the nature of life that are a bit contrary to the ones that we brought up with. The ones that are more traditional, ideas that believe in things like nature spirits and elemental beings and nature beings and angels and higher beings and lower beings and what have you beings, all part of the marvelous thing we call life. An idea which is really part of our ancient history, although it's been neglected in recent times, but maybe far more true than the views that we're being supplied with at the moment. And if I could have the next slide, please. Some of my material comes from publications by the Finhorn community. I don't want to spend any great time telling you about the Findhorn community, except to say there was a bunch of people in northern Scotland who did this work in the 1960s on and onwards, who took a piece of fairly arid and sandy land that nothing much would grow on, and proceeded to grow remarkable crops of everything imaginable on that land, and claimed that their success was due to the fact that they were cooperating, willfully and deliberately and willingly cooperating with things like nature spirits and elemental beings. They attributed their success to this cooperation. In other words, tending to indicate, if not prove, that life is more complex than we just imagine it is. And if I could have number 13 back again, the one with those quotes on it, I want to draw your attention to something which these elemental beings claim about themselves. If I could have the bottom one there, please. And there's a portion of that quote. I mean, it's all very interesting, but the part that's particularly pertinent to what I want to draw your attention to is a sentence that I've tried to highlight. It begins with, "We are children of the vast reaches of space, as much a citizen of any place, as much as a citizen of any place. Before a planet can come into existence, we are, and we bring the planet into existence." So if we're talking about other civilizations and life in the rest of the universe, how can we ignore a claim like that? I mean, we might not believe it, but it certainly is most relevant. If we want to understand the UFO phenomenon and the nature of life in the rest of the universe, and some aspects of life that we could study on planet Earth would help us to do this, to get a greater understanding, isn't it appropriate for us to do so? Especially when this sort of information comes backed up by what you'd call agricultural miracles, by this community doing things that should be impossible. I mean, I'm not saying that proves that elementals are real, but it proves that you ought to at least pay some attention to it and have a good look at it first before you say this has got to be rubbish. Somebody had a hand up?
I'm just wondering, you said that it was impossible. In what way?
Oh, it is, in the context of our normal agricultural experience, what these people were doing was impossible. All the experts came and said, this is impossible. This shouldn't be happening. Right? In that sense, it was obviously happening there. The evidence was overwhelming. But no one could explain it. So what I'm trying to say here is that these people weren't just making claims. They were working, and they were backing up their claims with solid objective facts. So they're at least worth having a look at. Now, you may probably find that your own experience is very similar to mine, that as soon as you started looking at the UFO phenomenon, you felt compelled to look at everything else, because suddenly you had to fill in all the blanks, that all the questions that this subject raises had to be filled in somehow, and there wasn't anything you wouldn't look at in the hope of finding answers. Now that may be true of individuals, but unfortunately it hasn't been nearly as true of our community as a whole. Some of you will be aware of the message that this particular book tries to convey. Anyone familiar with it? I guess many of you aren't. This is a fairly recent discovery. In the last, certain things have been observed for decades. Certain things going wrong in our ecosystem have been observed for decades, but people couldn't put a finger on what was going on until just the last decade or so, even less. In the 90s, it suddenly became clear that of the many tens of thousands of chemicals we are producing, a certain number of them behave like hormones. They can either mimic a hormone, especially the female estrogen hormone, which many chemicals seem to be able to mimic, or they can block the action of a hormone. Now, you only need concentrations of 1 part in a million for these sorts of effects to become significant. And our environment is already polluted to that degree. And these substances are highly resistant to degradation. They just persist for decades. And they become concentrated along the food chain till when you come to dolphins and whales, in the oceans, for example, these substances are concentrated by millions, by 20 or 30 million times as much as they are in the ocean water themselves. And then an Eskimo eats them, and some of the most polluted people are in the most pristine environments on the planet because of the way in which this stuff is carried around the planet and the way it's concentrated in the food chain. Now, these hormone mimicking and hormone blocking devices can have dramatic effects on development of fetal life especially. When any living thing, including a human being, is born, the cells divide, and pretty soon a lot of hormones are produced to control the development of all the organs of the body. And for example, in the case of humans and mammals generally, all fetuses are essentially female until some of them who've got the X and Y, who've got the male chromosome bits, start to change and become males. Now that development can be completely interrupted by these substances. So you have male animals and humans with inadequately developed sexual organs, their brain development is interfered with, and their behavior is interfered with too. So you have animals, we see animals in the wild that no longer look after their young. They no longer pair and reproduce. And if they try to do it, they're far less successful in doing it because in the case of the males, their sexual development has been greatly affected by these sorts of hormone substances. In short, our planet is polluted. We're all subject to this, and the male fertility has already halved in the last generation. We're seeing the effect of it in the human population now. And with each generation, the baby of a mother has got a higher concentration of these substances in its body because the first thing the baby gets from the mother is food. It respires a lot of the fat material. With the fat material come these substances which then reside in the baby's body. So it gets a higher each generation has more concentration of these things in it than the one before. So we're heading for problems. And that's part of the consequences of intellectual hypnosis. It's right here, right with us. We're only possibly a generation away from doing the kinds of things that those grey aliens do when they abduct humans. They've got a tremendous interest in human reproduction. And we've got indications that they themselves are not reproducing their numbers anymore. They need to maintain their population. We could be in that situation a generation down the tracks if we don't find a way to fix this problem without technical fixes, because the technical fix will only take us further down that track. So these are the developments that have brought us to where we are, and we're on the verge of engaging in genetic engineering with people who have a mindset about the nature of life which is dead wrong. It's completely incomplete in my opinion, and I think history will prove that to be so. And do you think they're not going to make some terrible mistakes on the way? And some of these mistakes may virtually threaten our existence on the planet. It's time we learned a few lessons and perhaps learned from the experience of others. We don't have to learn everything firsthand. Some of it we can very well learn by learning it from someone else who's been through it. Okay, maybe we've become a little more humble now than we were 50 years ago when the world was ours and we could do no wrong. We have perhaps learned we can do wrong even when we're not trying to. And maybe we can listen now. Okay, well that brings me to our efforts to understand the UFO phenomenon, which is part of the UFO quest. We want understanding, we search for it. No one tells us what's going on. Most of the UFOs flying through the skies don't tell us anything, they just fly through the skies. In the abduction phenomenon, which is quite a big process, it involves quite a lot of people, remarkably little is told us as to what's going on. They don't explain themselves, they don't really tell us why they're doing what they're doing, etc. And what communication does take place seems to be buried in the subconscious of the persons involved, and that's interesting too. It's like something rather like a time bomb, you might say, that is being buried in the subconscious of the humans involved in that process. It is not in our conscious mind and we're not doing anything with it. But if you take a broader view on the nature of life, then you can ask a whole lot of other questions that haven't been asked. For example, many of us have noted for quite some time that a person who has reported an abduction experience often finds that in the time following their abduction, their paranormal faculties are considerably heightened. They are more precognitive, or perhaps they sense people's thoughts better, or a whole array of things. One man who reported his experience to me in the 80s, he found that he could smell fires, even if they happened on another continent. He'd be smelling fires, and next thing he'd hear about some great conflagration somewhere on the planet. It takes all kinds of forms. Now, is it not possible that, now first of all, paranormal faculties are things that we all have. It's been demonstrated. One humble demonstration is firewalking. Some people can get themselves in the right frame of mind. They'll walk across a bed of red-hot coals. They come out the other end and they haven't singed their feet. They don't have to go to hospital. They may jump a bit, but they haven't really burnt themselves. And I don't think there's any doubt about it that firewalking can be a genuine phenomenon in the sense that it is not physically explainable. That's paranormal, in my terminology. Now, we have an array of such faculties. When our paranormal faculties are properly activated, we can heal much faster, for example. We can cope with emotional traumas far better. It has been well demonstrated in a variety of ways. What is there to say that in an abduction phenomenon, the abductees' paranormal faculties aren't activated to quite a considerable extent? And all sorts of, maybe it's exploited or whatever the reason is, and when we see this person showing more of this paranormal sensitivity subsequently, it's merely a residue of what happened during the abduction. Now, I'm pointing this out simply to say, if you don't accept paranormal things as possibly real, you'd never even ask that question. And if that was actually happening in an abduction, you'd never find it, because you weren't asking the right questions. It's just so important to be as open-minded and as broad-minded as possible. I'll give you another example. Following on from the work of Baxter and others, it's been discovered that a living cell taken from any person's body continues to be connected to that person. For example, we have white blood cells in our saliva, and it's a simple source of white blood cells from any person. A saliva sample with the suitable instruments attached to it continues to mimic the emotional ups and downs of the person it came from, as long as those saliva things are alive. Now, in a typical abduction case, tissue samples are taken from the abductee. You know the scoop mark stuff? And that's only the samples that show. What about the ones that could have been taken from inside the body? Fluid samples and organ samples, etc. Now, and these remain linked to the host that they've come from. Suppose you were to take a tissue sample and culture it till it becomes a large body of tissue material. What then is the relationship between that body of tissue material and the person it came from? Is it, for example, a way of tracking that person's emotional ups and downs and even their whereabouts? Possibly. Is it perhaps a way of even drawing some kind of vitality off them? After all, the life that we have is shared amongst all the body parts we have. If part of you suddenly becomes a tissue sample in somewhere else, is your life still? Obviously, it is still being shared with that bit of sample as well. One of the aspects of the abduction phenomenon is that the children produced by the efforts of the ETs involved often are not very vital. They seem to be rather lifeless, etc. You may be sure that if, for example, the use of tissue samples is one way to link the baby up with some human source of vitality, these things would be done. See, we haven't even talked about things like that because we haven't been prepared to ask the questions. I'm not saying these things really happen. I am saying that could well be happening, but we haven't even thought about it yet. And this is the cost of intellectual hypnosis. It's interesting that one of the claims made about early crashed UFOs that have only emerged to my knowledge in quite recent times was that some of the crashed UFOs of the 40s and 50s contained human body parts. That's the allegation. I'm not saying it's a fact. And this is one of the things that really gave the authorities a shock, and they didn't know how to cope with it, and it's part of the reason for the cover-up, we're told. Now, obviously those body parts could have been taken by capturing living humans and chopping them up. They could have been obtained by humans who got hurt in wars or accidents in such a way, or they might have been cultured body parts too. See, once we look at this notion of maintaining a link to a living human rather than just having a piece of a dead human, other issues arise. So there seems to be something to this aspect of the phenomenon that we haven't asked questions about yet. And I think one of the biggest is what is being done to our consciousness. If a plant and a human individual can be connected like this in some sort of share of consciousness, and if shrimps and a plant can be connected, don't you think that humans and humans are connected too? There's all sorts of stuff buried in the subconscious of abductees. And my estimate of the number of abductees in our population is 3% or thereabouts of our population. So three persons in 100 are walking around with abduction experiences buried in their subconscious, together with who knows what else. That's going to flow into the subconscious of all the rest of us. And it's going to work itself out somehow in time to come. It becomes part of our collective unconscious. It's going to influence our development. But how is it going to influence our development? Is it for good or ill? We don't know. We haven't even begun to ask these questions yet because we've been intellectually hypnotized. Can you see the cost of being hypnotized like that? I hope I've broadened the subject out for you a little and encourage you to look at aspects that perhaps you haven't looked at before. How am I going this time? Mr. Chairman? He's not here. Oh, all right. All right. Okay. So we're on the quest. If a distinguished public figure came to visit our homes, we would clean and scrub and tidy up. We'd really prepare for the visit. We'd want to present ourselves at our very best. I'd even put my tie on and do just as I'm doing here. Believe me, I don't do this every day. We do that, right? And now the UFO phenomenon means other civilizations are visiting us. Some of them obviously highly advanced because they're coming here. We can't go there. Clearly advanced, possibly spiritually and socially advanced too. And what are we doing to clean and scrub and prepare so that we don't embarrass ourselves in this meeting? We aren't doing anything. We refuse to talk about it happening. We ignore it. 1 minute, wow. Okay, now part of the quest is just this very thing. If we're ever going to have open contact with other civilizations in this galaxy, we have to do our best to be worth saying hello to. And we don't want to embarrass ourselves. We don't want the meeting to be an embarrassment to all concerned. The UFO quest is very much about us cleaning up our act, pulling up our socks, doing things different, getting rid of all the things that really are to our detriment and don't reflect well on us. Having open exchange with other civilizations is rather like being on a super internet. All kinds of information now becomes available to us. All kinds of technology now becomes available to us. We have to be mature enough to use it to our benefit, not to our detriment. And with the sort of record we've had in the last 50 years of managing to muck up almost in every avenue of existence, we have to become very different to what we are if meeting other civilizations and the consequent exchange of information is going to do anything but destroy us. That's an important part of the quest. Don't be surprised if all the contactees have what seems like a spiritual sounding message, like their Christ return. That's exactly part of the issue. We have to become different kinds of people. And in this regard, I'm going to skip over some of the rest of what I've said and just highlight, oh, not yet, one more, the last slide, please, the Frank Howard one. Fortunately, there is a lot of helpful information on how to pursue the quest, on what the rest of the universe is like, and how we can short-circuit some of our areas of ignorance, one of which is the publications by a man called Frank Howard. Frank lived in Brisbane. He produced his books in the late 70s towards about 1980. He produced 4 of them. The first one was A Planetary Saga. I would suggest it is very close to the Questor's Bible, if there were such a thing. I knew Frank personally, and at the time I thought he was just a good writer. But I've discovered since that Frank's home was one of those places where ETs could come and spend the night, and where ETs could come and meet selected people. And in his book, when you read him, he never claims that when he went for a ride in a UFO that was infactual. I now am quite convinced it was factual, but he never claimed it at the time, and I wasn't sure what to make of his work in those years. But I'm fully convinced that Frank is genuine, and what he has to offer is most valuable. I happen to have 10 copies of the book following on from this one, The Return of Ali Zantel, which just goes on with information like this, which you're welcome to have. You can have them for about $5 each, a good price for that. So you see, we haven't been left out. Even in Australia, someone made sure that we would have access to the kind of information we needed if we wanted to take this other side, the quest side of the subject, seriously. The search side, we know what to do. We report sightings, we analyze the stuff, we do all the scientific stuff. That's the search part. The quest part we have to pick up too. Because if you only do the quest thing, you tend to get into trouble. You tend to come ungrounded. We've seen this, you know. We're going to be taken up in UFOs and all the rest. Remember what happened last year? It didn't happen. People who are on the quest side but don't keep themselves grounded by also doing the research bit, they can get lost in this way. They can get carried away by someone who's lost the plot a bit. But if you do both, if you do the research and stay with the quest, you're going to be much more balanced and get much further. And I think this is what I hope we go for research will become more and more as the years go by. And I encourage you to look at this option. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Martin Gottschall. Our next speaker is Paul Norman from Melbourne, Victoria. Now, Paul began investigating UFOs in the 1950s back in the United States after he saw a major keyhole of the old NICAP group, the National Investigative Committee for Aerial Phenomenon. He saw that the show was cut off on a coast-to-coast TV broadcast. I wasn't watching TV at the time, but I remember reading about this at some point later. That was very mysterious. Major Keyhole was giving his assessment of the situation, and he was cut off, and no reason was ever given for that, so the American people never got a chance to follow up on some information he was trying to give to the American public about the UFO situation at that time, which was a pretty heated matter at that time. During the 1960s, Paul migrated to Australia, and he continued his research with the Victorian UFO Society, VUFORS, of course, where he's currently working now. He's going to be covering the Knowles family abduction, which is probably very familiar to all of you here. VUFOR's investigation of this Knowles encounter at the Mundrabilla in January 1988, debunked the debunkers. In other words, they gave the real facts behind the situation. I've seen a lot of news broadcasts that I managed to dig up on this incident, and coming over here recently myself, I was not surprised, but a bit dismayed to see the way the media had covered it and generally made fun of the Knowles family. And I guess the Australian media had a good old time with that incident. But of course, they took it very seriously, and there was a lot more to that event than most people realize. When you read the details, a lot more went on there with these people. And of course, Paul will be showing where the skeptics went wrong on this investigation and the vast difference between the speculation and the actual investigation. So here to give you the real story is Paul Norman.
Thank you, Mike. This case, the Knowles family encounter, is known otherwise as the Mundrabilla incident. January 21st, 1988, excuse me, commenced as a routine day for me. After awakening, I switched on my bedside radio for the morning news broadcast. There was mention that some sort of a UFO incident had occurred on the area highway near the remote Munderbilla Roadhouse about midway across the Nullarbor Plain in Western Australia. After shifting from one station to another, the story began to emerge as a significant case worth a follow-up investigation. A Perth woman, will you put the light on and show the family here, please? Faye Knowles and her three adult sons, Patrick, Sean, and Wayne, had claimed that an unidentified flying object had picked up their 1984 Telstar and gave it a shake before dropping it back to the ground. The next slide shows the car. I dressed hurriedly and rushed to the news agents for copies of the Melbourne newspaper to see what was being published about the incident. What made the story more interesting was the policemen were taking the report seriously because of physical evidence to support the claim, and there were other witnesses. After reading the newspaper versions about the event, I finally got a telephone call through to Judith McGee, president of the Victorian UFO Research Society, ViewFors, in Melbourne. She had been tied up all morning answering calls concerning the fast-breaking story. Meanwhile, more details were coming to light concerning the incident. The family had stopped at Munderbilla before the restaurant had opened for business. 3 truck drivers were waiting to have their breakfast. One driver, Graham Henley, from Melbourne, was the first person to talk to the family about 30 minutes after they had left the scene where the action took place. Mr. Henley said that all 4 were distressed and in a state of shock. 2 dogs were carrying inside the car in a state of fright as well. The car was covered with black sooty substance, which was described as a fine silicon type material. Now the debunking attempts. As the news began to spread by the press, radio, and television, the skeptics, armchair experts, increased their debunking attempts even before investigation had commenced. Within 48 hours, 5 explanations came in rapid succession from the scientific community, all contradicting, non-satisfactory. This was the type of mysterious events that makes ufologists out of academics and clowns out of skeptics. One of the first explanations came from a professor of impossibility, a PhD, etc., as being consistent with a meteorite, in spite of the fact that the object landed on top of the motor car before flying away moments later. Following this attempt, another solution was put forward by a second gentleman of learning. The description of the event was consistent with dry lightning, even though other motors were driving along the highway and viewed the maneuvering object and confirmed that no electrical storm was in the area. After that amusing interpretation, another spokesman from the scientific community came up with a solution again, that the occupants were fooled by the rising sun, even though motorists traveling in the opposite direction saw the object fly away in the opposite direction. Another expert said it must have originated at the Woomera test range. That statement was followed by another spokesman who said that this could not be true because it would not be allowed. My own opinion is, of course not, unless it was out of control. But even so, how could a missile strike or lift a motor car and drop it to the ground with other minor damage? Prior to the arrival of the car in Adelaide, where the first debunking efforts were made, the Knowles experience was being treated seriously until the dedicated debunkers got into the act. The first samples of the dust alleged to have been analyzed were done by employees at the laboratory in Adelaide. The statement released to the press was the dust was mostly iron oxide, consistent and residue from worn brake linings. The large amounts of dust was ignored. The report was distributed to Australia and overseas if it were God's gift to the skeptics. Apparently the first analyst did not realize the matter, the fact that the matter would be taken further afield. Whether the report was an effort to cover up some other reason, I am not prepared to state. The opinion of other analysts is that the dust from brake linings was mixed with the dust from other parts of the car. Viewforce samples taken such as the family was mesmerized, these are other debunking efforts, they were mesmerized, dozed off and overturned the car. Our UFO experiences occurred during dozing off stage, and while awakened, that's a dream time for ufology, made the situation urgent that ufologists to begin investigation. The facts are, dreams do not leave holes in the ground. Dreams do not lift motor cars off the road. Meanwhile, the first person to have spoken to the family after their terrifying experience, Melbourne truck driver Graham Henley, broadcast a statement that theories aimed at debunking the encounter were a lot of rot. He said he had felt the sooty material and it was not brake dust. He had been around the car racing scene as well as being a truck driver and knew that brake dust only gets on the wheels on the roof, not on the roof rather. Furthermore, the brakes were not even hot. It was the coolest part of the morning. Besides, he was convinced when the Knowles first told him what they had experienced earlier, that they had seen something frightening. When he saw the terror on their faces, even the dogs were scared. Now, when they told this story and he saw that they were sincere, he and two more truck drivers and the manager, what is the next slide? It might show where the car hit. Went back up to where this car had hit the ground, where it had skidded and all the indication. And the story that they had told was that they hit the car tire on the right side. Now, we know that there were dents on three sides of this car, but not on that side, the rear right-hand tire that hit the ground. It is even if though something had got a grip on three sides and lost. Well, when they went up there, they found where the jack was, where they had jacked up the car to change the car. The first one, they hit the ground, they got out and went over under this bush here because the object flew around quite some time before leaving. They found the tracks of the four people, the two dogs, and it all ties in. There's a vast difference between speculation and investigation. On January 25th, the Knowles family were interviewed by four members of the Victorian UFO Research Committee at the home of their relatives in Melbourne. where we found the family still in a state of distress and suffering from an assortment of symptoms, including a swelling of Faye's right hand. We learned that the encounter occurred before daylight, after the family had left the Madura Roadhouse and were heading east toward Monterbella. When they sighted a group of lights, they thought at first these were street lights, but then realized there were no street lights in this part of the outback. During the 3-hour interview with the mother and 3 sons, we were told several details of experiences. Although it was difficult to determine the sequence of different phases of the activity, some of the highlights were clear in the memory of one or more members of the family. They were a very upset stage at this point. Beginning about a quarter of an hour before the lights were first seen, the car radio started malfunctioning with a lot of static, which continued for the entire period of the encounter. This is a characteristic of the electromagnetic effect when UFOs are near ignition systems, power lines on ignition systems of airplanes. At another stage, Sane saw another light ahead. He thought at first that it was a truck with one headlight, but it got closer, he saw that it was not a truck, but a strange brightly glowing light on his side of the highway. So he had to swerve to the wrong side of the road and looked up just in time to see an approaching car pulling a caravan. They almost collided, and Graham Henley confirmed to us that he had passed a car pulling a caravan up ahead at that time. And by the way, we had another case only about 2 weeks ago up near Echuca. A truck driver almost ran over one. He too thought he was meeting another vehicle. That case is now being investigated by Jim Owen, our investigator for that park. And there's already a story in the Echuca paper. We will have a report in our next edition of the Australian UFO Bulletin. Soon after the near collision, the nose met another vehicle with a light flying at the same speed above the car. It was a Tirana, to be exact. But this time, Sean's curiosity got the best of him, and he made a U-turn and sped back toward the west to see what the light was like. Another quick turn, when he followed this Tirana for a little distance, the light left the Tirana and started back west, so his car. This time, Sean panicked in another U-turn. He headed back to the east. The object overtook the car, and they heard the thud on the roof, and Faye Knowles reached out on the roof. She felt something like a warm sponge, which she interpreted as maybe a suction cup. Patrick said he did not know what to do. The dog started to go crazy. Another characteristic when a UFO is nearby, animal reaction. All 4 felt as if they were about to die. Patrick said that he felt as though his brains were being pulled out of his head. They were really upset. Sean did not realize that the car was in the air until it dropped back on the ground, bursting the right rear tire. Maybe the next slide shows the, yes, yes. He thought he was doing full scale to escape from under the UFO while the object was on the roof. Faye rolled down the window so she could reach up. It felt like a warm, well, I'll mention that a little ahead of myself. And that was the arm covered with dust. And later on, I intend this, where the source of this dust is still a real mystery, but I intend to give you sort of a guess like what it could have been. Sean reported that at one stage he was out cold and could not remember some of the details relating to other members of the family. During the time the car was in the air, their voices sounded as though they were talking in slow motion. Now, I've thought possibly this might have been a time effect, because we know when the UFOs are around that they strong feel could affect the time. I'm not sure. I have no tangible evidence, but I've thought that. During that time when it was in the air, the other sounded, they slowed down. When Sean brought the car to a stop, all jumped out and hid in the bushes, which this showed, and along the side of the highway until the UFO flew away. The family described the object as a white light about the size of the car with a yellow center, like an egg in a cup. The sound was similar to a humming transformer. Now, this is the most common sound heard around UFOs, but usually they have to be very close to the object. It's a nearest sound they can compare is a low humming sound like a transformer. They changed the tire as quickly as possible before speeding on to Mundrabilla, where they talked about their frightening experience with these truck drivers previously mentioned. Now, one of the drivers, Graham Henley, he was driving at 4 or 5 kilometers ahead of him. He saw a light, green light, in his rear vision mirror, but he didn't know at the time that it was anything going on like this. He didn't know till he and these truck drivers were waiting for the breakfast, and the Knowles family pulled in alongside. After the interview, he realized that the case required urgent follow-up investigation on a priority basis. On the 30th of January, I arrived in Adelaide and met with the official with Channel 7 TV, who arranged for inspection of the car. Dust in sufficient amounts for several laboratory analyses was vacuumed from inside and outside the car, and also scraped from the brake linings to compare with samples taken from the car. At this point, I'd like to bring what the skeptics were saying about because it was a blowout. It was a blowout, but they said it put out the statement that it was running on the rim. Well, if that being the case, if it's gone very far on the rim, it would have been battered, as you know. We found the radio, which had malfunctioned during the encounter, to be operating satisfactory. The dents on the roof were found to, just as the family had described, they were very slight, with the largest one about the size and depth of an ordinary saucer. Reports of a rack or baggage stripped to the roof were false, as we learned from the family. A story being told both locally and abroad was that the damage was caused by the roof rack, and the owner was trying to collect insurance money by telling the story. Philip Klass, America's foremost UFO debunker, offered the story as an explanation. So much for his method of scientific investigation. There never was a roof rack. The tire was found to be damaged from a blowout, which I've shown and described. On the 20th of March, I left Melbourne for San Francisco, arriving there in time for the Bay Area branch meeting of the Mutual UFO Network in Mountain View, where I gave a set of the dust sample to Dr. Richard Haynes, a scientist from NASA's Ames Research Center. A few days later, Dr. Haynes submitted the samples to the state-of-the-art Phillips laboratory, and this laboratory, I noticed about a month or so ago, has manufactured one of these high-tech laser beams. There's quite a story in that. Since the laboratory is one of the most advanced in America, with many people using its facilities, we had to wait our turn. In a letter from Dr. Haynes dated 12th of July 1988, he enclosed a report entitled Scanning Electron Microscope Results of the Mandrabilla dust and other samples. The interior dust was not from the brake system of the car, he reported. This was in direct contradiction to the original findings reported by the analyst in Adelaide. The Phillips Laboratory analysis also revealed the presence of oxygen, carbon, calcium, silicon, potassium, and others. The analysts found fibers typical of the element 85 astatine. Now, I don't understand enough about this to know what residue that life because of the half-life of astatine. It said this was possible as a relative long fiber. However, it does not combine in fiber-like form. On July the 3rd, I returned to Melbourne. Due to the briefings with the VHS Committee and the necessity of catching up with accumulated correspondence and other matters, I was delayed until the 22nd of July before going to the Nullarbor Plain and other areas in Western Australia. Priority for the trip was, of course, due to the fact that the Knowles experience had emerged as the foremost mystery case of the decade in Australia. Now, we have a major case in Australia. I've noticed the real big ones come about every 10 years. It was the Frederickville Indians disappeared over Bass Strait, 78. This was 88. This is 98. Maybe we are in the beginning of a flap now, according to reports coming from around Echuca. The highlight of the itinerary was, without doubt, a visit with a resident of Norseman, who was on the Nullarbor area at the time of the Knowles encounter and had a report of his own experience. Not only did this key witness provide me with accommodation, hospitality in his home, but spent many hours driving me to the spot where the car had skidded and over several miles around the Nullarbor Plain talking to other witnesses. Now, he also had seen a UFO sighting that morning, and he came along at same day before he knew that this incident had happened, and there was dust covering the highway. He waded through it, and later he started having symptoms like nose, swollen feet, and all this sort of thing. Later on, he went to the doctor, but he didn't mention this incident. But first couple of years later, he had his toes take off, and then he lost a leg by whatever ailment he was. Finally, both legs. He passed away about 2 years ago. It appears that dust sample back from inside the car was the best samples of free from contamination from outside sources. The appearance used to analyze, the apparatus rather, used to analyze the dust was a scanning electron microscope with an ejectanesis and ECON detector. Some of the particles were magnified 5,000 times. The mention of possible radiation in the samples aroused my curiosity. Since I had suspected some sort of radiation, my reason for thinking was due to the swelling in face, hand, and hair falling from the dog in patches, as well as other symptoms. And the hair did grow back to the dog, I understand, later on. 1 hour after the Knowles left Mandrabilla, they stopped at the Border Village service station to inquire about the cost of a tire. The attendant with whom I spoke said, "I thought at first the four were trying to be funny, but they were telling me, when they were telling me about their experience, they were excited and scared. When I got near the car, I noticed an odor, he said, similar to that of hot insulation. And there was definitely a scent like ozone. The first police station to receive a report directly from the nose was the Seduna station at South Australia. One policeman told me the whole family was in a state of shock. They gave him the same story they had told others. The policeman said the dust was definitely not brake dust. There was too much and it was different. On the morning of 2nd August, I arrived in Perth for another visit with the Knowles, including Mr. Knowles, who had not accompanied them on their trip to Melbourne. Mrs. Knowles and her son had by then, 6 months after their frightening ordeal, settled down to a normal routine, but were still eager for some information and results of tests so they could have a better understanding of their experience. All the members of the family expressed appreciation for help from Beaufort's committee, the only people other than relatives who had shown concern for the welfare. When in Melbourne, they received independent medical and psychiatric examination and care, including hypnosis to sort out the experience of events during the running of the encounter with the unknown object. There were certain aspects which caused some anxiety, such as the swelling of hand and arm, the patchy loss of the hair from the dogs, and in the general reaction of the family. Our concerns stem from knowledge of other cases where close encounters had caused similar symptoms. Research is not confined to one single incident. These sort of cases are being researched all over the world. During my visit, the Knowles family mentioned several instances where they had been mistreated by the media, and the media, as you know, tried to make a circus out of this. But the average journal, he writes and talks about everything, experts on nothing except misquotations and out-of-context reporting. As well as individuals interested only in making money out of their predicament. During the course of events following the episode, their car was repossessed and sold at an auction. Mrs. Knowles had requested that I drive the car from Adelaide when returning to Melbourne on the 4th of February. They were visiting relatives at that time. They considered the vehicle to be jinxed after the experience and wanted to sell it because they needed the money. I was interested in buying the car myself and give it a fair price to help relieve their burden. In addition, I wanted to drive the car to Melbourne, where the Ford Motor Company was interested in conducting tests on it. About an hour before I was due to leave Adelaide, a man knocked on the door of my hotel room to tell me that the owner had given him permission or authority to keep the car in Adelaide for an exhibition. When I arrived in Melbourne, I learned that the Knowles family had been told that I did not want to drive the car to Melbourne. A lot of deception in this where money is involved. Finally, I want to emphasize the vast difference between speculation and investigation. I think we want the next picture here. Now they're following. Now, the difference between speculation and investigation, to use a practical illustration. Again, the person involved was a proclaimed advisor to an Adelaide group of skeptics. His explanation was that the family what they saw was the headlights of a vehicle descending the hill at Eucla, 100 miles to the east. The fact is, when a vehicle is heading west from Eucla, the headlights are shining into a cliff, and until it turns to the south at at which time the headlights are pointed to the south. It does not head towards the west again until it reaches the valley, where the headlights cannot be seen to the west. You know, they're 100 away. I know I was there. I was there two times doing that scene. Now, as I mentioned, I want to do a speculation, and I mean it's a speculation. I do not have tangible evidence. I want to go to another case. I still have some time to illustrate. If you give me the next one, please. Next one, two more. Another one. Yes, it's a White Acres case. A farmer tenant was waking at 1 o'clock in the morning with his cattle in a panic, more animal reaction, the horse galloping around the paddock. He went out on the back porch and he saw what looked to him like, at the time, like an airplane about to crash. But to his amazement, it leveled off and flew on down to a water tank about a kilometer away. The next slide, please. See if that shows. By this time, as a kilometer away, he's still watching from the porch. He thought maybe it was a helicopter smuggling a cow. So he hopped on his motorbikes and sped down to where it was, and he saw that a dome-shaped object. It said, at first it was hovering over the tank, and that tank was using it as reserve water. At that time, the windmills were pumping sufficient water to the troughs. And the rocks that the farmers had thrown up against the tank to keep out of the way of the mower, it didn't pull the large one as far. There was a trail of rocks. It didn't pull the big one as far as it did the little ones. And when it took off, when he was down there that night, he still saw something falling from it, that he thought the object was falling apart. And but it made a whooshing noise, and then after it got about 20, 30 meters high, it became silent and sped off toward Bass Strait. But they went back the next morning. That's when they found that the word gravel, still a smaller one. This tank was empty. It had 1 foot of water left. The algae in the bottom was pulled up the sides. Now that it wasn't a matter of this object throwing a hose over and pumping out. It didn't hover over a minute. It pulled the water out. So we wonder, this gravitational pull, did the operators, whatever they were, turn off this before they settled on the ground, still in effect pulling this around. And another case, the next one, please. Still another one. That's the one you can see going toward Sale up that way. That tank over to your right. And it's the next one. I want to get to the next slide, please. Oh, yes. Where it was on the ground, it rained a couple of days later, and water stood in this circle here like beads of mercury or oil. The composition of the soil had been changed, and this happens quite often, cases like this all over the world. Some cases where they've been on the ground, you hit the ground with your knuckles and it sounds like beating on a board, but this effect lasts only about 3 weeks. Well, I took samples down to a scientist in Melbourne. He took it over to Monash to be analyzed, and the report that we got was, yes, there was some peculiarity about it, but we think it was our equipment. This is the reason I take samples further afield, get where we have a percentage of scientists with already their mental blocks have been shattered probably. We do get a small percentage of better cooperation. Now the next one too, please. One more after that. The similar case, this happened only 2 weeks after this Mondrabilla case. I mean the White Acres case, where a farmer was driving along. There's a bridge here and a passenger, and he saw what he thought was an overturned car ahead. When he got up, so his identical thing, shape and all, like this dome structure that was at Whiteacres. Well, he panicked. He put his foot down and he sped on into Mafia there, reported to the agriculture department, and colleague and I went up to check that. A few days later, we found where the agriculture department had taken samples. But the peculiarity here was that there were large grains of superphosphate around these circles. And there was no superphosphate used in that particular paddock. But it had been used in a paddock 4 or 5 kilometers away. So tying in with the experience on the way they collect the residue, where they sit it on the ground, where did this mystery dust, all this amount of dust came from? But if you can recall, they were pretty close to Montelinga there. If this theory is correct, that perhaps the UFO, under these same principles and conditions, characteristics, some of the dust stuck to the object that landed on the nose sky. And at one stage, when the Americans came out, were intending to clean up the area for their Aboriginal to move back, I had a promise that if they found any this dust, they would present the samples for me to compare. We still have some of these samples overseas available, but that part did not materialize. Now, I do have 2 or 3 more minutes that I would like, if I may, do a commercial. We have a CD-ROM of the Stanton Friedman talk. We have 10 copies, which is probably the leftovers, probably the ones left in Australia. And we also have a bulletin, a 32-page bulletin published quarterly. And the next edition will be this new case, vote on this new case I just mentioned going on at UCLA. They're available for sale if you're interested. And this is as far as I intend to go on this particular case, but thank you for your attention.
From different parts of the country here. We don't often hear much from Western Australia. Elizabeth has a Bachelor of Social Work degree in counseling and psychology from the University of New South Wales. She practices privately in the Perth area as an intuitive therapist and a psychic healer, and is a writer and a public speaker. Her new book, Secrets, Truth, and Destiny, has just been published. In fact, it's at the table back there, and of course she'll autograph it for you. And on the cover I noticed, I haven't read it yet, I just picked up a copy, and on the cover I noticed it says it's Australia's answer to the Celestian prophecy, so if that's true, it promises to be a very enjoyable read. Elizabeth's incredible and confronting alien encounters began in 1992. 4 years later, the depth of her inner life was dramatically revealed through spontaneous memory recall and hypnosis, disclosing a lifetime of alien interaction. And I just had a private a word from Elizabeth riding up in the elevator that events like this, of course, spark a lot of things in people. For a lot of us, it's a great source of enthusiasm to carry us through the rest of the year. But for a lot of people who do have direct experience with this phenomenon, these kind of meetings and gatherings, of course, will spark a lot of recall and spark things in the mind to come forward to the conscious mind, to the forefront of the mind. And she was just saying how some more information came to her just being close to this event just the other night, I guess. So hopefully she'll share some of these new revelations with us, and of course her experience in general. Please welcome Elizabeth Robinson.
Great. Thank you. Good. Can we hear me?
That's for the machine there.
Oh, great.
There you go.
Okay. Well, I'd firstly like to say that it is such an incredible pleasure for me to be here today. And, you know, when you live with these experiences and you hide away in this very secret life that you live with this profound amount of confusion and fear of ridicule. It's really like living in two separate worlds. And it's extremely difficult to even contemplate coming forward. And you know, I work as a therapist in Perth, and I work with people who have this experience. My colleague Mary Rodwell, who you'll be hearing from tomorrow morning, Mary sees most of the people. We've got this in-joke, I have the experiences and she works with the people. We also run the only professionally run support group in Australia for people with experiences. And time again, I hear from people how extremely difficult it is to come forward, to even think about sharing this with family, with friends, let alone going public about this. And as was just said, last night I went down to have dinner and coffee, and I was sitting with Glenys and Mary and others. Came back to my room and I thought I'll just peruse through my talk for today. And I was washing my face and I felt a sense of somebody else there with me. And that somebody else was another being. I felt a grey with me. I felt other beings with me. And then for the next 15-20 minutes, I went into an incredibly vivid, probably the most vivid spontaneous regression. And I was 4 years old and being taken onto a craft. And I'd like to perhaps share that with you because I'd like to put that in my book too, which I'm currently writing. It's incredible the amount of memory that comes forth when you don't know. You know, you don't expect it. I certainly didn't expect it. Sometimes I think, oh, you know, I've got all this in hand, I've got it all together. And then, you know, the beings must be up there laughing at me and, you know, everybody else laughing at me, because I don't think we can really ever get this together. It's so enormous. It's like, you know, millions of doorways. You go through one and it opens up other possibilities, other information. So it just keeps unfolding like a map, you know. And I think perhaps when I'm 99, I'll get what this is all about. But I'd like to give you a historical perspective today. I feel so short. I feel like I need a box, you know, to stand on. They needed to make me about a foot taller. So I'd like to give you a historical perspective, my background, how it all began for me. And as was said, I've written a 404-page book, which has been an enormous journey for me to even write the book. And that's available today. So I had to squish all this into 1 hour, so it's really not enough time to even get to any sort of detail with you. But if anybody wants to ask me questions, or anybody's interested in buying the book, I'll be up the back later on and throughout the conference proceedings. In 1990, I left work as a clinical medical social worker. And I was merrily living a very normal life. I was a social worker who worked in hospital settings. I did advocacy work with people, counselling, therapy. And in 1990, I had my daughter Jessica. And it really created such a transformation and adjustment in my life to have this baby who was crying all day long and so forth. And I started to question life. I started to wonder what the dickens, you know, this was all about. And lo and behold, I began to do a daily meditation, or put aside time for myself each day. And I automatically noticed, spontaneously noticed, a sense of increase in my psychic capacity. And it was astounding. I mean, from one day being a normal person, then the next minute being able to download from the universal internet, you know, detail of my husband's work, of clients of his. He'd come in and I'd say, so-and-so must be anxious about her front door in, you know, some suburb in Perth. And he'd say, did she call? And it was just very, very detailed psychic capacity that developed very quickly. And at the same time, I also had spontaneous regressions to what I have come to know were past lives. And these would be vivid. Nothing, I could see nothing of this reality. I would be thrown back, catapulted back into another lifetime. One happened in the middle of my pool, swimming pool, and I almost drowned because I was in the middle of an ocean a couple of 100 years ago trying to save myself. So I guess that the background for this, the beginning to see these beings, was that I was searching. I was searching for a deeper meaning to life. And then one day I was doing the housework, and I came out of my bedroom and looked over to the right-hand side, and lo and behold, I saw 3 beings like this, silhouetted against my former lounge room wall. And if anybody, I mean, no one can imagine what it's like to just stand there and be confronted by something, by a reality that our psychiatric profession and our religious institutions and our society says does not exist. And yet I was seeing it. I felt completely crazy. I felt confused. I was confronted beyond belief. And if we can just have the next slide, please. I hope this works for me. Okay, so that's what they were like. Three beings. They looked at me with a sense of intention and intent, and that's what was very, very fear-provoking for me. Their sense of knowing me, and it was interesting because at the time, even in writing the book, I just described that experience. I went on to, in the next couple of weeks, to become very fearful of the dark. My daughter Jessica then came up to me one morning and explained her experience, which I'll get to in a moment. But it wasn't until the last 12 months that I've begun to do a lot of media interviews, and journalists began to say to me, "What happened? What happened next?" And I really didn't know. I had no memory of what happened next. I just thought I got on with the housework. But I'm beginning to wonder. Because I don't have any memory. All I remember was the beings being there and experiencing this profound confusion. So it'd be interesting to go back to that experience and see what happened next. So next slide, please. This is my gorgeous little poppet, Jessica, at 3 years old, 2.5, 3 years old, and she is the joy of my life. She's just so beautiful. So I love sharing a little bit of her with everybody during my talks. Jessica used to, she developed speech. She was very verbal very early, about 9 months old, and by 2.5 we were having lengthy conversations together. And she came into me, after I had had this experience, and my fear of being in the dark, of going to bed, began to heighten quite significantly. And at some points I had to have all the lights on in the house just to be able to go to sleep. And of course it was very difficult to go to sleep. And she came into me and she said, "Mummy, I had a visitor last night." And I thought, oh yes, this is imagination. And I said, "Oh, what was it like? What was the person like?" And she said, "Well, she had no hair and a big head, and she had no clothes on." And I thought, oh my God. And she said she took me out the window and up and upstairs and gave me something to eat, and she brought me back down. And gosh, I'm feeling the profound shock and the incredible fear that absolutely racked my body. I thought, not only are these beings here for me, they're involved with my daughter, who I loved like a precious jewel. I didn't want them to be here. I didn't understand what was going on. And later on that day, we were in my office, and we were just cleaning up my office, and then I walked out, and probably about a minute later, I walked back in. And if we can have the next slide, this was no, not that one. This did this at the last conference. I was hoping it wouldn't do that to me. Yes. This drawing was on my desk on a little piece of paper. And I knew, I mean, Jessica was verbally advanced, I guess, for that age, but her fine motor skills were not that advanced. I mean, certainly I knew she didn't do this. And I said to her, "Who did that?" And she said, "That's the lady." And I said, "Well, what are these?" And she said, "The eyes." And I said, "What is this around here?" And she said, "That's the head." And I said, "Well, what's this line around the outside?" And she said, "That's the silver." And, you know, children are used to talking about and writing and drawing with primary colours. Why would she say it was silver if it wasn't? So these experiences kept going on, and my level of confusion and fear was enormous. You know, one of the challenges for me in writing about this stuff and my experiences and talking about it is to try and get across to you how incredibly confusing and difficult it is to live with having these experiences and retain some sort of normality to your life. And it's really like living in, you've got your feet in two separate worlds. One is crazy and bizarre, and you have these experiences, and the next moment, literally the next moment, you have to go to your childcare centre, and I'd have to pick up Jessica and talk about the cake stall. You know, just incredible. I don't know how I survived this well, which maybe some people would doubt. I'd like to just show you, interestingly, the next two slides of Aboriginal cave drawings in the Kimberley area. And these are called Wandjina, and I'm sure probably most of you are used to have seen these before. And the Aboriginals in the Kimberley area refer to these as Wandjina, and they're the creator beings from the sky. And I find that quite interesting, given what Jessica had drawn, or whoever it was had drawn, the similarities, the halo around the head and the huge eyes. And there's another one too after that slide. I remembered during my childhood, and I used to have a huge fear of the dark, and I remembered a clown coming to visit me, and I was petrified of this clown. So you started to piece all these things together. And I remember asking my mother and saying, "Do you remember this clown that used to visit me?" And I was terrified of this clown. And she said, "No, but I remember you talking about a blue horse that would come to you at night." And I find that fascinating, because I had not remembered this blue horse at all, and she had no memory, you know, of this clown. Yet that was what was held in my memory, and it actually triggered a memory of the blue light. And that really started to rattle every cell in my body when I began to think of the blue light. I'd also talked to friends at school about these friends that had come and visit me and take me onto their crafts, and I did that till I was about probably 11 or 12, and then I stopped. Because I knew that, you know, I was starting to get ridiculed for it, and to me it was a reality. So not only did the greys start appearing to me, but I had quite profound experiences of, it was like that ad on the television, "Saw your light on," you know, thought we'd drop in. I began to have other experiences of other beings that would appear to me. And the next one is, I love this drawing. This is my drawing, and I have no talent in drawing at all, as you can see. And the other drawings that I use are illustrations. My illustrator for the book, Jane Melchior from Perth, and I almost cringe when mine comes up, but I try and allow people to see it in a light, humorous way as my attempt to draw. I always hated art as a child. This is a being a group of beings that would appear to me that I call loving light beings, and their energy was beautiful, just absolutely beautiful. The love that would exude from these beings, and they would hover in the air. They would just float like this, very balletic, very beautiful. And it was like this particular being was my teacher or my guide. And I remember having a dream around that time, and she took me through like a hall of memories. And she said to me, "You must move on from here. It's time for you to fulfill your true reason for being here." And I would see them as balls of blue light. And I know perhaps many of you have read, if you've read UFO books or heard people speak about this, many people refer to these blue balls of light that they see. And then I would see this being appear. And interestingly, after that dream, I spontaneously developed an ability to heal. And began private practice from my home because I was a medical social worker. I mean, I was dealing with specialists, medical specialists, surgeons, coming from this environment. And I remember one meeting, I was with a whole ward of staff, from physiotherapists right through to specialist surgeons, and I looked over to my left and there's a grey walking through the room. And I turned to a psychologist friend of mine, and I said, "Did you see that?" And she said, "See what?" And I thought, oh my God, I'm really going off my rocker here, It was like that. It was just so bizarre. I needed like 60 lead weights on my feet to really keep me grounded. So this presence of this being really heralded my rite of passage forward into my healing work, which has become extraordinary. And I'd like to perhaps share that with you if I've got some time in the end. Just very quickly going through the next slide. I can't go into the detail because I'm going through this, losing time very quickly, but this was another group of beings. I was having lunch one day and about 50 odd beings, military type alien beings, just came through the wall of my home, just manifested in rows and marched into my lounge room. And I was having lunch with a very psychic friend of mine, and the energy was intense. It built up very, very rapidly. And for those of you who can't sense energy like that, it's like someone turned several heaters on in the room full bore in the middle of summer, and take out the heat, and that's the energy you feel. And they said to me that we'd come to talk to you. We're from the Galactic Federation. And I thought, what a load of rubbish. I mean, I'm really going round the loop. Galactic Federation, what are we, Star Wars here or something? And it's quite hilarious actually to read about it in my book, and I go into detail obviously that I can't do now. But this friend of mine was equally as silly and tried to use humour to get past these bizarre experiences, and she just turned to the salad dish, and we were having lunch, and she said, "Oh, well, I wonder what they want," as she was making herself a news. And that's how ridiculous it was. I mean, and in fact what happened after this experience is that two of the beings stayed with each of us, and they seemed to be monitoring us. And what we did is we sent them light in our wisdom, and we thought that would disintegrate them, because they were like holographic images. And because we didn't talk to them anymore when they first moved into the room, they just disappeared, like that holographic image. It took about 5 minutes and they just faded. There was no sense of aggression. I mean, I call them military because they were in uniform. And a couple of weeks earlier I'd had a healing and gone into an interdimensional state, and that's what this particular picture is illustrating. And that was another experience that I can't go into, but I do in my book. If you think that that's as bizarre as it gets, wait till you see the next ones that appeared to me. It gets better. Hold on to your seats. Can we have the next slide, please? Oh. One day, a couple of weeks later, the same person was coming for lunch, and I was in my kitchen, and I turned around. I was preparing lunch, and I saw a huge insect, and it was the most incredible thing I'd ever seen. I was completely terrified again. I had no idea. I thought, well, huge cockroaches or, praying mantis that I thought they were. Now I know this is it. The little men will be appearing in the wagon and taking me off and strapping me up any minute, because I thought this was the epitome of craziness, to see these ridiculous things. Yet what was the most frightening was that they were incredibly powerful and incredibly intellectual, and they had a sense of intent, like, hello, we're here. I tried to ignore them, And I just went on with what I had to do. They came back while we were sitting having lunch, and of course my husband, I describe at length what happened to my relationship and how difficult it was for him as an engineer and businessman and you know, high-powered person in Perth. You know, we were all having dinner and these beings appeared again, and I fainted and slumped into my chair because their energy was so different to mine. And I thought they were trying to attack me. So that gives you a sense of where I was at. I really felt that you know, these beings were evil. I thought that they were dreadful. I didn't want them in my life, any of them. You know, I just wanted to be a normal woman, a normal mum. I wanted to have a normal life and live in suburbia. So we had planned a trip. And of course my marriage was really rocky by this stage because I think he thought I was going crazy as well. And so we went to Queensland a week later, 2 weeks later, and I'll just show you the hotel. We were in the Pan Pacific Hotel, for those of you who know Queensland, Broadbeach. And the next 3 slides are, this was my view from the hotel, and this is to the extreme left, and then each one, if we can go through them. Next one, yeah. Each one shows you the distance away from the ocean. We were very close to the ocean, and what happened very briefly is that the Greys appeared to me, and they came. I went to bed about 11:45. They walked towards me, and I was terrified, completely terrified. And another abduction scenario happened. All I remember was my right arm going numb, and starting to telepath to them. And it was extraordinary when I woke up the next morning, because I thought, what the hell was I doing, talking to these things, you know? And I said to them, well, if you're going to take me, I want to be able to have memory of the craft this time. And that blew me away in the morning, to think that I said this time. What was I talking about? I had no idea. And yet the memory that I retained was of this dimly lit environment, like a hospital, at about 2 o'clock in the morning, very clinical, but the lights turned down, and small rooms. I remember being shown up corridors and into small rooms, and that's all I remembered. So after that experience, I wanted to shut down. I wanted to close down. I could see my marriage disintegrating. I didn't want to continue on in this bizarre reality, and so I shut down. I had changed social work jobs. I was thrown into a huge path of personal growth and personal healing, looking at childhood issues, looking at patterns and things that had happened in my childhood to make up my belief system. I wanted to block it out. I actually thought, as a therapist, that something really crazy had happened in my childhood to create all this, and that I must have been abused or something, and that was the reason for all this happening. So I was really trying to ground myself and clutch at straws to come up with some answers. But what happened was that I began to actually have more memory, spontaneous memory. And those of you who are familiar with post-traumatic stress syndrome, this is it. You know, a fear of the dark, a fear of, or having fears that you don't know the origin or the reason for, a particular phobias, of being in particular places, memories. I might be driving to Coles supermarket, and on the way I would see a rod being inserted into my mouth and down into my stomach. I'd feel intense fear, and then I'd have to get out at Coles supermarket and remember what I'd gone there to buy. So enormously difficult. Then I saw John Mack on the television on the Oprah Winfrey show. And I'll just tell you actually while you're looking at that, it was in February last year, and I had some hypnosis around this encounter. Just before the hypnosis session, I was driving back from Margaret River, those of you who know Western Australia, and I went into another spontaneous regression where I was floated out and over to the ocean. There was a huge craft waiting for me. And I remember looking down at the ocean, you know, washing around at about midnight, very frightening, and being taken on board to have a chat with the insect beings. And then that really changed my mind about who they were and what they're here to do. But I just wanted to mention that because if you can imagine being floated out there, up so high and at night, it was very traumatic. So when I was introduced to John Mack through the Oprah Winfrey Show, it was probably the first time that anybody had honoured this experience for me. And I just wanted to read just a few words of what he says. He says, the only thing that behaves like this is real experience, trauma. Psychosis, madness isn't like that. Dreams are not like that. Fantasy is not like that. And when I heard him say that, and I instantly knew he was a Harvard medical professor, a psychiatric professor from Harvard Medical School. And he had, with great courage and humility, come forward and said, these people are not crazy. This experience is real. And what happened was I ended up in a ball of, I fell to the ground off my sofa, and I cried my heart out because I was trying to deny these experiences. I didn't want really anyone to say that this was real because this introduced a new depth to my experience. Someone of that calibre saying, I'm sorry, this is a reality. I would have really rather him say, this is a new wonder drug that we're giving patients to stop all this from happening. So I wrote to John Mack, and the day that I wrote and sent off his letter, I had a huge spontaneous regression to when I was 5 years old, and I could see the craft above me. I felt cold, I felt frightened. I was being taken out into my backyard in New South Wales, in a country town in New South Wales. I could vividly smell the camellias and the bushes and the gum trees, and looked up into the awaiting craft and this very, very powerful beam of light that was shining down on me. I got up and I got myself together out of my office, and I went into a colleague's office, and she had to do some work with me, some therapy with me, just to bring me into the reality and back to the moment so that I can continue to see my patients that afternoon. So, you know, it's not an easy ride going through all of this. So what happened is that in 1996 I attended the first UFO symposium, and I went along there and I thought, you know, what am I doing here? These will be a bunch of Spock fans, or, you know, wearing Star Trek t-shirts, and what I discovered was, you know, a room full of people and speakers that were highly qualified, you know, nuclear physicists and right across the board, therapists. John Mack was there, and I thought, my God, you know, and I kept on going shopping because that's one of the ways that I cope with, you know, and switch off. I go shopping, and I just leave the conference and go shopping. And what happened was I began to develop pains in my wrists, and I later found out that I have implants in my wrists, and found that out several months later when I had hypnosis with Matthew up the back and Bob, who were extremely wonderful to me. I wondered why I had these searing pains in my wrists. And the Saturday night of the conference, what happened was that we were supposed to have guest speakers at the table, and at my table there were no guest speakers, and we thought, well, what's going on? And it became the first opportunity for me to go public, if it was only 6 people, and say, well, look, I've had these experiences. I went up to my room, and I thought I was going to go to bed a bit like last night, and whack, I went back to when I was 5 years old, and I could see the craft. I knew they were coming. Mummy, you know, won't hear me. She can't hear me. No one can hear me. They put them to sleep. They're coming. I know they're coming. They visit me all the time. And I came out of it, and I got up, and I thought, my God, because they had shown me visions of the destruction of the earth, pollution. They showed me dead fish along the rivers, and they said, we are concerned, you know, this cannot be, this cannot go on. And I knew at that moment that I had to talk about this, that I was going to write a book about this, that I was going to, you know, travel and speak about my experiences. And you can imagine, I mean, I went to that thing, I didn't know why I was there, I didn't know why I was at the conference, but my life changed forever. And a couple of days later, I had met and listened to John Carpenter, who's a therapist from the United States, and I approached John and I said, look, you know, I've had a few of these experiences, but I think, you know, I really think that when we get to the bottom of this, it's something else. And he booked me in for a 2-hour session, and honestly, it was nothing to compare with the ghost ride at Luna Park. It was profound. And I'd just like to go through a few details to let you know what came up in that session. I went back to when I was 5 years old, and I was taken up onto a craft. I was in a room with probably, in the vicinity of at least 100 other human beings lying on metal tables. I looked across, and it must have been almost like a war zone, you know. I described people having bits and pieces of flesh taken from their body, equipment inserted into their ears and nose and so on. What was happening to me is that they were gearing me up for something that I would do, some special important task I had when I was older. I went from there to when I was 18, and this becomes more and more incredible. And at 18, they took me and impregnated me, and I had all the symptoms of pregnancy. I described being taken back several weeks later and the fetus being removed. Profound reaction and emotion. The trauma that I went through, the crying and sadness, the grief, was just enormous. You know, being separated from that child, it was incredibly profound. And amongst anything, I mean, we can sit here and say, look, this is just a load of hooey. This is ridiculous. But as a therapist, I know that the one thing that is very real and gives you an indication that this is real is the intense and very powerful emotions that are experienced. So I also talked about my purpose and my purpose for being here, and that I had been having interactions with these beings all my life. And I came out of that, and honestly, I didn't know what the hell I was going to do. I remember being in a state of profound confusion. Almost like, you know, you've discovered that you know, your parents are not the parents, like you were adopted or something. But huge impact on my life. And I returned to Perth and tried to get on with my life. And what I would experience was, you know, I'd be lying in a ball on my bed, crying for the grief of not being able to be with these children. And during that hypnosis session also, I had I've been introduced to my son, and I cried and was so stricken with grief at not being able to be with him. And I remember a meditation that I had after I came back to Perth. And can I take this off? I want to be able to walk around a bit. I don't want you all to fall asleep. I remember having this meditation, and I saw my son. This was a time when I was taken onto a craft, and I saw him, and he did this trick with a ball. And you know how children, those of you who are parents, you know when your child has got a new skateboard or roller skates or a bike and they go, look what I can do, Mum, you know. Well, this is what he was looking at me, and he was telepathing to me, look what I'm about to show you, this is very special. And he held out his right hand, and he had a silver ball in his hand. And then he looked at the ball, and I could feel a sense of focusing, that he was focusing, you know, with his mind on the ball. And it began to spin, and it began to hover, and it hovered up, this ball of light that it was, and up his arm, across his shoulders, and down the other side, and into his hand. And he was very proud of what he could do, and obviously something that he had learned on the craft. I remember going to the Forum meeting, and they'd asked me to come out and I explained this, what I'd seen in the meditation. And Mike Jordan, he was a counsellor at one of the universities, and he turned around to me and he said, yes, I've read that, and an American abductee had written that in her book. And I just thought, my God, you know, someone else has experienced this. Instant reality check, you know. I couldn't stand there, and I wish he hadn't have said it, because it was so hard for me to know that someone else had seen that same thing. So what happened after that is that in January I came over and had a call from Matthew Favaloro, and he and Bob worked as hypnotherapists in Sydney. I ended up having several other hypnosis sessions with them, and what I discovered was quite incredible, and I go through in my book and transcribe the hypnosis sessions. I discovered more children, up to 5 or 6 children. I discovered other implants. I went through and described the implants in my wrists. And interestingly, the implants in my wrists are about awakening memory and triggering memory. And it was on the Saturday at the first conference that my memory was triggered. You know, I had the pains in my wrists, and then that night, wham, you know, the memory came back. So I thought that really fit. Interestingly, and at later hypnosis sessions, what happened again? I had another hypnosis session, a couple of sessions, a couple of months after the ones with Matthew, with a psychiatrist who was absolutely blown away. But what happened in that session was that my wrists became so painful she had to stop the session and focus on deactivating the pain or dulling the pain in my wrists. And it was because I was coming up with all new information about the insect beings and other things. So, you know, you get this correlation and this sort of, you know, constant verification and validation of the information, which is quite scary. So I began to understand that, get a sense of a huge overview of a bigger picture forming. And up until that point, I still wanted to deny it. I still wanted to not realise that this was a reality. And just briefly going through what happened is that I understood that there was this galactic federation, and that there are many different beings who have come together who are incredibly concerned about the Earth and where it is going. I guess by that stage I'd gone through so much personal growth and grounding that I couldn't deny this reality anymore. Certainly, you know, it was something that I couldn't turn away from. I was on a roller coaster and I couldn't get off. And they said to me that I would be writing books. They said that I would be travelling the world and I would be speaking to people like I am today about my experiences, that it was so important for us to recognise what we were capable of. And by this stage, my healing work had taken extraordinary leaps and bounds, and I was working with people with cancer, children with cancer. I was able to see into the body. They told me that I had an implant in my forehead that actually gave me telepathic skills. I had constantly received information. I would receive information when I'd be working with someone, a client or a patient. I'd be able to get visions of past lives and other information, see beings in spirit. And so, you know, I had found that the beings, the purpose was more of a spiritual one. And I began to realise that I was a soul being, and that every experience was certainly within my orchestration. And I have come to understand that that is probably the only way, one of the only ways in fitting this jigsaw puzzle together. And so what began to happen, other things happened, electrical disturbances. I was sitting at a cafe one day with the psychiatrist and other people, and she was talking about the way the world is going. She feels the way the world's heading. And then all of a sudden, I felt this sensation behind one of my eyes. And then I felt this focusing in on her, and I could see this like computer chip at the back of my eye, like in my mind's eye. I could see the back of my eye. And it was like, you know, this implant had turned on, and they were really focusing on what she was saying. It was extraordinary. I interjected into the conversation. I said, my God, you know, I'm having this experience, this incredible experience with my eye. And one of them turned to me and said, oh yes, I've read about that. I was reading a book about a guy in America who'd had an eye implant, and his exactly the same description, you know, a sense of something turning on in the eye, seeing the computer chip at the back of the eye, and then this intense focusing, like it's being looked through by somebody else. Extraordinary stuff. you know, my lights would go on in the house, my stereo would turn off, things would jump off the shelves, you know, no one was in the room with me. It just went on and on and on. And after the hypnosis sessions with Matthew and Bob, I had an encounter in the hallway of my home that I just wanted to very briefly, and I think we've got a next slide should be of that. Oh, okay, this is one I've missed. This is a dream that I had of beings. I was in a crystal room, like a laboratory, with crystal, pieces of crystal right up to the ceiling, and it seemed to go on and on forever. And I knew that they were collecting these specimens of crystal from the earth. But these are the sort of dreams and flashbacks that I would have of being examined. At that time I had a rod, metal rod inserted in my mouth and down into my stomach. We'll just go through to the next one. Oh, and this is the, sorry, I got carried away with my talking, you see, that's what they used to say on my school reports when I was little. She doesn't learn anything because she never shuts up talking. This is what I saw, the image of my hybrid son and the trick that he did with the ball. So we move on. So what happened was that these people came to renovate my house, and they had one of them had told me that he had had a previous encounter with hooded light beings, and I can't go into that, but it's all in my book. After the encounter, and these beings had 3 fingers, and the beings surrounded him. He was out on a farm, and they actually ended up protecting him from a guy who we think was actually trying to murder him. He'd really gone off the rails emotionally, this other friend of his, and had got a gun and was arrested that night for shooting at other people. And I know it's not very clear, and I apologise for that, but you can actually see this being came up to him and put the 3 fingers on his shoulder, and if I can just hop over here, oh no, I can't, oh dear, okay. The 3rd finger is missing. This finger is missing from the actual symbol on his arm. That was a burn mark that he woke up with the next morning from his encounter that lasted 12 months, and it was like a welt on his arm. And he didn't take that photo on purpose. He went on holidays afterwards, and this guy ended up sharing this experience that he had with his older brother, who was a millionaire businessman. And 2 days later he was admitted to a psychiatric institution because his brother had tipped off the psychiatric emergency team, told them he was absolutely going round the bend, and he ended up in hospital, and he got out by saying that he had taken drugs, which was completely untrue. So what happened was this beautiful man and another man who actually worked for my husband, they were renovating my hallway, and to cut a long story short, we had an incredible 2-hour encounter that we thought was only about 20 minutes. We had 2 hours went by. I don't know how it went by, but we had missing time. We had no sense of gravity in the hallway, and we were in an interdimensional space. We were in like cylinders that had all this like fog or energy moving around us. The beings came through. We were floating in the hallway. There was literally no sense of gravity, only in our feet. There was a sense of being weighted down in the hallway. And we were given healing. The beings approached us, and they were incredibly loving. They moved me around the hallway. I was pushed forward, and I was not controlling my movement. They did some surgery on my kidneys, on my backbone. They operated on the others. It's quite an astounding encounter, and it's really worth hearing about, but I wish I could share more of it with you. And then the next slide is another aspect of it, where we were moved into position of like a triangle, and we had to hold up our hands, and this crystal appeared in the middle of the 3 of us. And that was looking down on the top of it, and we had to each hold this crystal. And then I was drawn with this incredible force out into my garden. Another guy was actually drawn out into the garden, and then we came back in to realise that it was 11 o'clock in the morning, and the encounter had started at about 8:45. It was one of the most incredible things I've ever been through. So I'd like to very quickly move through to my conclusion around this, although, you know, there's no conclusion yet. I mean, I don't even feel that I've got to the tip of the iceberg with any of this. I think what's happening is that we are being awakened to the fact that we're not the only kids on the block. And one would question, you know, why they have to use such tactics. Well, I think that they have to use such tactics because if you look at the movies that come out of Hollywood or the biggest rating movies on the television, what do we see? We see violence and we see terror. The only reason that I have been on TV so often, on radio so often, and appeared in numerous national and international magazines is because the media absolutely hang on every fearful word that I say. They want to hear the blood and guts of it, and I think that is the higher purpose behind this. I think they have to have created a scenario that is so damn terrifying because most of our society, that's what we connect with now. You know, where do we see on the news the loving, beautiful experiences? The news programs are filled with terror. This person got blown up. This person got murdered. Okay, you know, if we were the Galactic Federation, we'd stand up there and go, okay, it's like social work. One of the lecturers kept saying to us, you've got to start where the client's at. And I hated hearing that. We heard it about 1 million times during my 4-year degree. So if they all have a Bachelor of Social Work up there, and they're there saying, let's start where the client's at, what would they organise? They'd organise these dark little beings with the big eyes, and they'd get them to stealthily creep into the people's bedrooms at night and absolutely create havoc and terror. But what I see is people going through a profound sense of spiritual transformation. And certainly that's what has happened to me. Every facet of my life has changed completely. I am not the person that I used to be. I see life very differently. I'm more conscious of the environment. I'm more conscious of every day of how I can assist, how I can be the best that I can be, how I can help others, how I can bring this understanding to people, how I can be in a more loving relationship, how I can be the best parent and create a sense of consciousness and really walk my talk. And this is something that happens to almost everybody that goes through this experience. Yes, people are traumatised. Yes, there's fear. Yes, there's profound confusion. But what we don't hear about so often are the healings that are involved from these beings, the incredible love. I've been involved also, I haven't mentioned the human beings that I have been involved with, and they seem to be from our future. They have been coming to me since I was 9 months old, and I refer to them incredibly as my family. And I talk about the fact that, you know, they're helping me to do what I've come to do. And they've performed healings on me. They constantly check and see if my health is okay. You know, and I always ask them, you know, to make me more fluent and more confident and to help me in my daily life be able to share this information and experience with you. What I see many people doing is looking at the UFO area like they've taken the foot off a human and they study the foot, and the foot is the UFO experience, okay? So we're all staring at the foot and we say, gosh, I wonder what this thing is. And we haven't seen a human being before. And we say, well, isn't this fascinating? Look, it's got 5 things off the end and it's got this skin-like substance around it. But we're never going to get the bigger picture if we don't join this foot to the rest of the body. I mean, how the hell can we stare at the foot and say, well, look, it's got a sense of consciousness, it actually can breathe, you know, it can love. It's not until we take that foot and we join it with the rest of the body. And the rest of the body I look at as the healing ability, the fact that you know, people have psychic experiences, mental telepathy, out-of-body experiences, the soul, the level of soul within the body. And a lot of people start to squirm at that because I've spoken to a lot of UFO people who don't want to look at it like that. It's much harder to do that because it's almost like this exclusivity that we get into with looking at the UFOs, wondering about ETs and trying to get the evidence. You know, there's this, I've got the evidence, I've got a piece of the craft. But you know, more and more what I've come to understand is that the evidence is in our consciousness. And when we become the incredible light beings that we can be, I think that our potential, we haven't even begun to use not even 1% of our potential. You know, the way that I find myself being able to telepath, I can do the most incredible things with the help of the universe, of course. But my healing ability, I've had people come to me with cancer that have had tests afterwards, the cancer has disappeared. I've had people, I actually work with doctors in spirit, and I know that sounds really crazy, and it was crazy making when they first appeared to me around the table. And I have performed many operations with these doctors working through me and passing me equipment. I can see into the body, we can diagnose, and it's all quite incredible, you know. And if you'd have told me 10 years ago that I would have been here telling you about my psychic surgery and my experiences, I would have laughed at you. But what what's happened to me through this whole experience is that I have come to know myself and who I am and what I'm capable of. And if I can do one thing in sharing all this with you, it's say, you haven't even begun yet. There's so much more to life. There's so much more to who you are and what we can be. I think we need to bring an awful amount more love and light onto this planet. And I'd just like to put up the next slide. I remember at one of the last conferences, and Robert Dean, who was one of the most beautiful spiritual men, I don't know how many of you were there and met Robert Dean, beautiful man, and he gave us the figures of, you know, 100 billion stars in our galaxy and 100 billion galaxies in our beautiful universe. And I wonder why it is so hard for so many people to understand that we're not alone. You know, why isn't this room packed out? That's what I want to know. You know, where the hell are the rest of them and what are they doing? Why aren't they here? Huh? They're afraid. They're afraid? Oh my God, they are afraid. I mean, I have confronted so many people, and I'm not a confronting sort of person. I mean, I just walk my talk and I say, well, look, this is what I've been through. People say to me, what is it that you do? And my stomach goes, ugh, you know. Well, I lecture on UFOs, but you know, people. What happens is that when journalists come to interview me, they walk in and they see me dressed up, and this is my credibility, you know. This is my excuse for spending money on nice clothes. You know, they have to be debriefed. They have to be therapized at the end of the session because they say, you know, it's so scary because you're so normal. They expect to find me with crystals hanging out my ears and like a turban and, you know, cobwebs hanging in my house and all this sort of thing. And what they realise at the end of it is that we're normal people who go through this experience, and how incredible it is to be normal. I think John Mack it was that said he's really always shocked at how normal people are given the trauma and the transformation that they do go through. The final slide, please. This is our beautiful Earth. And I remember actually one encounter that I went through, and I think it was with Matthew and Bob that I talked about. And the Greys took me to the edge of the craft, and we looked through a window. And they telepathed to me, they said, look at the Earth. And I had this intense sadness, and I'm feeling it often when I do these talks and talk to journalists. I get the feeling it's very profound, and they were so sad, and there was it was like the Earth was enveloped in this fog of sadness, and I knew that I had to help, and that each one of us can help with this. And it's so wonderful that you're all here today, because that's part of the way that you can help. And walk your talk, and don't be afraid to talk about what you believe in. And being here today with others, even though it is shocking, and even though I remember at the last conference I overheard a very well-dressed businessman say, oh God, no one knows I'm here. You know, I've escaped for the weekend. They think I'm on a business conference in Melbourne. And, you know, I couldn't tell anyone that I'm here. Well, why can't he? That's what I want to know. What is he afraid of? People thinking he's crazy. So I challenge everybody, please go out there and talk about what you know and what you understand. And to finish, I'd like to read some comments that I had a situation where my colleague Mary Rodwell and I, who you'll meet tomorrow, we were sitting down having a coffee. And, you know, they don't leave any messages. They don't knock when they come, you know. I wish they would. I could get myself ready. But what happened was that I felt this intense energy move over me. And I knew that someone wanted to contact me. And the following message was delivered to me. And they said, many of us are concerned about the situation on Earth. We see the plants and the animals and the trees and the fish and the rivers and the reefs and the earth itself crying out, pleading for help. It gets to me every time I read this. And we hear that cry as one single voice. And no matter where you are in time and space, that one single voice can be heard like a baby crying in the dark without a mother to care for it, to nurture it. And it was so moving, and it moves me every time. We really need to wake up. We really need to grow up and realise that we're not the only ones in this massive, beautiful universe. I think the earth and its people are like a disharmonious chord that is playing out into the universe. And I hear people saying, why do they care? Well, I think they're the ones that created us. I know they've been here all the time. And they do care because they're living in a beautifully orchestrated musical environment. Not literally, but symbolically. And it's like, I guess, parents of children who play heavy metal. There's a real, I hope there's no heavy metal fans in here. I think that the earth is playing out this disharmonious chord, and they can't go on because they hear it crying. And I just wanted to leave it there with you today and know that it's in each of us, each of our grasp, that we can do something to awaken. We can go on this path of searching and come to know ourselves so much more and reach out to others and do the very best we can. I've come to understand this thing about good and evil. And, you know, so many people, there's been Americans coming out here and talking about how they think that the Greys are evil and they're doing what they're doing, they should be stopped and all this sort of thing. But really, you know, what we've got to do is realise that we are the ones that orchestrate all of this for our own learning. I think they're only playing part of the script. I quickly tell you what happened last night, and I know I've probably gone about a minute or two over time. What happened last night is that I was catapulted back to this age of 4, and they took me onto the craft. And there I was with my freckles and pigtails, you know, and I was holding the hand of this very, very human lady. And someone said earlier, you know, they're here. Well, they're here. I mean, they could be sitting amongst you. I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. They are human, these ones. They're beautifully loving. They exude unconditional love. And they took me round onto the craft, and it was fine, and I was very familiar with the environment. They took me into a room and met some people, and I realised then I can't mention who I met. But I met someone who became very important to me in my adult life. And I was very frightened because I instantly knew, being on the craft, you become very telepathic. It's like, they're able to assist you to do that with the environment that they have on the craft. They telepath to you, and that's why people are very psychic, because they encourage that within you. So a lot of the time I've spent on crafts developing this psychic potential, the healing ability. Out of there, they then took me into a room with jars of these little babies in them. And the woman got down and she said, look at this, you'll be involved with this. The mummies have these in their tummy, then they're taken out, then they're brought onto the craft. And I was explaining this to Mary in the room, and I was washing my face, and I had my skin toner, a bottle of skin toner in my hand, and the damn thing was being rotated and rotated with the fear and anxiety that I was experiencing as I was reliving this. And then they took me into a room with an oval table and very, very official people. And that's when I really started to get very scared. And the people were very loving, and they were fine. They were just being introduced to me again. And what I was afraid of was, oh my God, this is the task. This is what I've got to do. I've got to tell people about this when I'm older, and how in the hell am I going to be able to do that? This is such an enormous responsibility. This is such an enormous task. To stop the person in the street, to get to them, you know, to get to the guy who's the businessman, to get to the mum at home. Not you people here, it's the ones outside that I want to get to, you know? And to really touch people. And what they did is they gave me a lollipop. They took me out of the room and they gave me an orange lollipop on a white stick, and they took me back and they put on this device on my head, and they made me lose my memory of that experience. And Mary and I talked about it for about half an hour, 3/4 of an hour later, and it was really profound to me, the sense of I'm not going to be able to do this well enough. And that's why it came up last night. That 4-year-old within me was very worried and had that huge responsibility on my shoulders of sharing this with all of you. So I hope I've been up to scratch today, and I hope I've given you a little bit of an insight into what I've been through. Thank you for listening to me, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. And really, I thank Brian for going to so much trouble. I know, you know, yet last year I had another profound experiences at the last conference. I think they're so important, and I think hopefully the next conference will get like 5 times as many people here to share in this joy of awakening. So thank you very much.